All right, so are you ready? Because today we are diving deep into the life of one of history's most iconic figures, Winston Churchill. We're using a document called The Incredible Story of Winston Churchill.txt. And let me tell you, this is so much more than just your typical World War II overview. We're going way beyond. That whole wartime prime minister image, I mean, did you know this guy's practically an action hero, like even way before the war even began?
It's pretty wild, right? You've got this kid born at Blenheim Palace, surrounded by privilege and all that, but then he's just like a total rebel at school. It's almost like he was destined from the very beginning to
Yeah.
defy everyone's expectations.
Right. Like, it makes you wonder if that's what really kind of set the stage for his political path later on. This is a guy who constantly went against the grain.
Exactly. And it wasn't just some youthful phase or anything. That independent spirit,
Yeah.
really shines through like his whole career. But here's what I find super interesting. Think about his early days as a war correspondent, right? Cuba, India, Sudan, the Boer War. These weren't just like adventures for him. They were really shaping his voice.
So you're saying like his writing career was actually key to his political success later down the line?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Churchill had this incredible knack for painting these really vivid pictures with his words, and he totally honed that skill in the trenches, reporting from the front lines. And years later, that same ability to just captivate an audience, that's what would make his wartime speeches so incredibly powerful.
Wow. So it's like he was unknowingly training for the biggest stage of his life.
And speaking of training for the big stage, what about his escape from a Boer prison camp during the South African War? I mean, come on, that's pure Hollywood material right there. It's insane. I mean, can you imagine the guts it must have taken to pull that off? And think about the impact, too. It wasn't just that it made him a war hero overnight, but it like catapulted him onto the national stage. Suddenly, everybody in Britain knew the name Winston Churchill.
And then just a few years later, bam, he gets elected to Parliament at just 26 years old.
That's Churchill for you. He doesn't wait around for anyone. He bursts onto the scene. But even then, he's already defying expectations. Remember, he starts as a conservative. But then just a few years later,
He jumps ship to the Liberal Party. That seems like a pretty gutsy move for like a young up-and-coming politician. What was the story there?
well, Churchill, always followed his convictions, even if it meant breaking with his own party. In this particular case, he clashed with the conservatives over their South African policy. It really showed that this was a man who wasn't afraid to stand alone if he truly believed in something.
So we've got this young, ambitious Churchill already making waves in British politics, and then he bounces around a couple of different government roles before landing at the Admiralty.
Yes, and it's in these early positions that we start to see some really interesting foreshadowing. So, as president of the Board of Trade, and later as Home Secretary, he's pushing for all these social reforms. But it becomes very clear that his real passion lies with the military.
Right, which makes perfect sense considering his background.
Exactly. But his time as First Lord of the Admiralty goes way beyond just like managing the Navy. Churchill was totally obsessed with modernization. He understood that technology was changing like the very nature of war, a concept that many of his contemporaries totally failed to grasp.
So he's pushing for a switch from coal to oil. He's advocating for bigger battleships. He's even championing like the development of air power. It's almost as if he's looking decades into the future.
That's exactly it. This foresight, this almost prophetic understanding of how warfare was evolving, it's absolutely crucial because it's the same kind of thinking. That will lead him to sound the alarm about Hitler years before anyone else is taking the threat seriously.
And of course, as we know, not everyone listened to his warnings.
Right, and speaking of not listening, his push for that naval modernization, while it was ultimately proven correct, it wasn't without its setbacks. The Dardanelles campaign during World War I is a really painful example of that.
That was a costly failure that really damaged his reputation at the time.
It did, and this is where we enter what historians often call Churchill's wilderness years. But even in this period, when he's out of the government, he's far from idle.
Yeah, these wilderness years are actually fascinating because on the one hand, it's this period of reflection for him. Churchill's refining his thinking. He's writing like crazy, really honing his political philosophy. But at the same time, he's increasingly consumed by this single looming threat.
Hitler, the rise of Nazi Germany, he's basically screaming from the rooftops about the danger. But so many people just choose to ignore him.
It's almost Shakespearean, isn't it? The prophet warning of impending doom. But his cries just fall on deaf ears. And just like with his push for naval modernization, Churchill ends up being tragically proven right. The Munich Agreement, this like desperate attempt at appeasement, It blows up in everyone's faces, and suddenly, war is inevitable.
And in Britain's darkest hour, who do they turn to? The man who had been warning them all along.
September 1939. World War II breaks out, and it's Winston is back at the Admiralty. You gotta admit, there's a certain poetry to that.
It really is a moment that captures, like, the essence of Churchill, this incredible blend of resilience and unwavering conviction. But let's be clear, he wasn't just back to manage the Navy. By May 1940, he's prime minister, facing an almost impossible situation.
France is crumbling, the British Army has barely escaped Dunkirk, a German invasion seems imminent. Talk about pressure.
I know, right? And it's right here, amidst this potential apocalypse, that we see Churchill at his absolute most brilliant. His first task, rally a terrified nation. And he does it, with one of the most powerful speeches ever delivered.
The blood, toil, tears, and sweat speech. Just hearing those words, it sends shivers down my spine.
It's a masterpiece of wartime oratory. There's no sugarcoating, no false promises. He lays out the brutal truth of what lies ahead. But he does it in a way that inspires defiance, courage, this willingness to fight for survival.
He tells the British people, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. And instead of cowering, they rise to the challenge.
That's the power of Churchill, right? He doesn't shy away from the darkness. He confronts it head on. And in doing so, he gives people hope. But brilliant speeches aren't enough to win a war. He needed a unified front. So he does something truly remarkable.
He forms a coalition government, bringing together rival political parties to focus on a common enemy.
It's a real testament to his pragmatism. Churchill knew that personal and political differences had to be set aside. To defeat Hitler, Britain needed to be united.
And then, of course, there's the crucial alliance with the United States. Churchill understood that America's involvement was absolutely vital to victory. He cultivated this close relationship with Roosevelt, exchanging countless letters and telegrams. He even made multiple trips to the White House.
Yeah, their partnership was definitely pivotal. But beyond the strategic importance, their relationship also produced some rather amusing anecdotes. I bet you've heard the one about Churchill wandering around the White House in the nude.
Oh, you mean the late-night encounter with Roosevelt. It's a classic Churchill moment. Cigar in one hand, drink in the other, stark naked, and when Roosevelt walks in, Churchill just quips, I have nothing to hide from the president.
Oh, it's such a good story. It reveals so much, like their shared sense of humor, the trust that they built during those super intense wartime years. But it also reminds us that even amidst the gravity of war, these were real people with their own quirks and personalities.
It's easy to forget that sometimes. We put these historical figures on these pedestals and forget that they were just as human as we are. But getting back to the war, Churchill's efforts to bring the U.S. into the conflict eventually pay off.
They do. The attack on Pearl Harbor brings America into the war. And soon after, Hitler declares war on the United States, solidifying the Allied alliance.
And it's not just the U.S. Churchill also recognizes the necessity of working with the Soviet Union, despite his deep distrust of communism.
Pragmatism above all else, right? He understood that defeating Hitler required putting aside ideological differences. And so you have this unlikely alliance, Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, led by Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. It's a testament to Churchill's ability to navigate all these complex relationships and forge these alliances in the face of a common enemy.
These war conferences, from Casablanca to Yalta, they must have been incredibly tense, especially as the focus shifts. From defeating the Axis powers to navigating the emerging Cold War.
Absolutely, there's a palpable shift in the dynamics. But throughout it all, Churchill remains this central figure, this constant force in the fight against tyranny. And when victory finally comes in Europe,
the scenes of jubilation in London on VE Day, they're unforgettable. Crowds flooding the streets, cheering for their wartime leader. Churchill addresses the nation and declares, this is your victory. It's a moment of pure catharsis.
It's a fitting tribute to the man who refused to give up hope. But then, just a few months later, in a twist that shocks many,
he loses the general election. It's almost unbelievable. After leading Britain to victory, the people vote him out.
It's a reminder that history is rarely simple. The British people, exhausted from years of war, yearned for change, a focus on rebuilding and social reform, and they saw the Labour Party as better suited for that task.
So Churchill's out of power again, but it kind of feels like a familiar story now, those wilderness years after the Dardanelles. He didn't just fade away back then, so what does he do this time around?
Well, pretty much the same thing. He throws himself back into writing, delivers some pretty powerful speeches, and he becomes like a vocal critic of the growing Soviet threat. It's actually during this period that he delivers that now infamous Iron Curtain speech.
Right, the one where he warns about Soviet influence spreading across Europe. It's pretty chilling how accurately he predicted the Cold War.
It is remarkable. Once again, Churchill demonstrates this uncanny ability to see these dangers that so many others overlook. And as these tensions rise between East and West, well, guess who gets called back into action?
Okay, let me guess. Winston is back. Again?
You got it. 1951, the Conservatives regain control, and Churchill, at the age of 76, becomes prime minister for a second time. It seems like the man just can't be kept down.
It's almost like a superhero origin story at this point. But this time around, it's a different world, right? It's a different kind of challenge. How does he handle leading Britain during those early years of the Cold War?
He approaches it with this really interesting mix of his, signature strength and a sort of newfound pragmatism. So he totally understands the Soviet threat, but he also recognizes the importance of diplomacy and rebuilding a war-torn world. This period also sees him receive a pretty unexpected honor.
You mean the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1953? It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. This wartime leader, this political titan, also being a celebrated author.
It really speaks volumes about the breadth of his intellect and his just sheer mastery of language. Churchill wasn't just a politician, He was a historian, a biographer, this just incredibly gifted orator, and a writer of incredible depth and eloquence.
It does make you wonder if those early days as a journalist played a role in shaping that literary talent.
Oh, undoubtedly.
Yeah.
Those years spent honing his craft, reporting from those front lines, clearly had a lasting impact. But even Churchill couldn't defy time forever.
So in 1955, at the age of 80, he finally steps down as prime minister. I imagine it was a tough decision, but he knew it was time for a new generation to lead.
And true to form, he doesn't just disappear from public life. He's knighted by Queen Elizabeth, so he becomes a Winston Churchill. But he declines a peerage so that he can remain in the House of Commons.
Always the parliamentarian at heart. Even in retirement, he continues to write, travel, offer his perspective on world affairs.
Yeah, his voice, even in those later years, it carried so much weight. It was the voice of experience, of someone who had seen humanity at its best and worst. And then in 1965, at the age of 90, Sir Winston Churchill passes away.
A life that spanned almost an entire century, filled with adventure, triumph, and setbacks. It's hard to imagine a more impactful figure in modern
He
history.
was a man of contradictions for sure, brilliant and flawed, courageous and stubborn, a leader who inspired millions, but also made his fair share of mistakes. But perhaps that's what makes him so endlessly fascinating. He was, above all, human.
I think as we wrap up our deep dive here into Churchill's life, it's clear that he wasn't just a product of his time. He actually helped shape it. He taught us the importance of resilience, of standing up for what you believe in, even when you stand alone. And he showed us that even in the darkest of times, hope and courage can prevail.
I think that's a great way to put it. His legacy is a complex one, full of triumphs and controversies, sure. But one thing is certain. Winston Churchill left an indelible mark on the world. And his story continues to inspire, challenge, and provoke debate. He reminds us that history is made by individuals who dare to make a difference.
And for those of you listening, if you're intrigued by what you've heard today, we urge you to delve deeper, explore Churchill's writings, his speeches, the countless biographies out there that attempt to capture the essence of this extraordinary man. There's a wealth of knowledge and inspiration to be found in his truly remarkable journey. Thanks for joining us
On this deep dive into the life of Winston Churchill.